Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of many things, including good theatre and good performances, which is not always the case with Shakespeare. Sometimes actors assume that because it's Shakespeare, they just have to walk in and deliver the language, and somehow that will make it good. Doesn't. So I thought I would give a few tips and tricks for actors approaching Shakespeare, whether they're approaching it for audition purposes or whether they're actually going into rehearsal for a production. I was going to illustrate each of these points by either performing or having an actor perform key sections, but that would make the video really, really long. Maybe I'll do something like along those lines at another time. For now, I'm just going to give you the ideas and let you wrestle with them. So first, prepare. And by that I mean understand the role that you're approaching. Even if this is for an audition, know what that speech, where it fits into the larger story. Make sure you know what that story is in case the people who you're performing for know it better than you do and they give you notes or ask you questions and you can't field them. It's going to affect your performance if you don't know where your little moment fits within the larger shape of the story. So make sure you know that. Also, have a good edition of the play to work from. I've said this before, I will continue to say it. Get, at very least, a Folger or a Signet or an Arden edition, maybe a New Cambridge, something along those lines. Something that has the text, nice, clear type, and it has footnotes and textual notes that will help you understand the way that this particular edition looks. This is true regardless of whether the production that you're working for gives you a text or not. You should always have a good edition of your own in which you can make notes and queries. I also recommend things like David and Ben Crystal's book, Shakespeare's Words, which is a good reference thing to have on hand, at least when you're working on the text initially. Understand every word, whether this is a monologue for an audition or the performance of an entire play. Every word, not the gist of the speech, every word. If you don't understand every word, you don't know that you're getting the gist right. If you must use quote-unquote translations like No Fear Shakespeare and things like that, use them only as a starting point, but be prepared to question those translations, right? We do Shakespeare because we consider the value of the words themselves important. So don't be relying on some sort of modern translation of the original. It's English, read it. And use those footnotes. Make sure you understand everything that you're saying. If you don't understand it, you cannot possibly expect the audience to understand it. And like all theater, Shakespeare is an exercise in communication, right? It's not just supposed to sound impressive. They have to understand you. If you don't understand it, they won't understand it. All right. Don't read from your phone. It's too small. It pulls you in too tight. Most editions that you're going to get on your phone are not going to give you access to things like footnotes, and it's going to screw up the lines, the actual arrangement of the line. Don't use your phone. Use paper until you're off book. Be big, but stay real. That sounds like a paradox. Shakespeare is by definition larger than life, right? Nobody ever spoke like this. Nobody ever delivered lines in iambic pentameter in ordinary conversation. It's supposed to be magnified. The feelings are magnified. The stories are magnified. The actors are designed to be emoting through language, right? This is not a small, quiet, modern kind of theater. It can be, but start with the sense of something larger that has to come out through the words. But don't become, that doesn't mean broad acting. It just means magnifying everything a little bit, right? and this obviously is going to change according to the nature of the performance venue that you're in, but begin by assuming that you have to be a little bit larger than life because the story is larger than life and the way the language is composed is larger than life. Use your own voice until a character choice by you or the director pushes you out of it, and assume that it won't, right? Don't put on something fake because it's Shakespeare. Don't try to do some weird pseudo-British dialect, right? If you're like me, you're the only Brit in a company of Americans, you may have to adjust to fit what everybody else is doing. Or, if the production is making certain regional choices or something like that, then you'll deal with that at some point in the rehearsal process. But the words have to feel like they are an integral part of who you are. And the way into that is by speaking them in your own register, in your own dialect. Don't let anybody tell you that Shakespeare is supposed to sound a certain way. It's not. That's all nonsense, right? Start in your own voice. Find your way into the text that way. Don't play pronouns. As with all these rules, occasionally you may want to violate it, but don't assume, but you should you should always assume that words like I and you are the least important words in a speech because they are completely self-evident to the audience. We know who's speaking. We know who you are speaking to. You don't need to underline that. Most of the time, the things that are going to need underlining are the key verbs and other words that are going to carry more of the weight of the line. Shakespeare is overwhelming. Shakespeare can feel overwhelming in the sheer amount of data that you're given as an audience member. So we have to use the emphasis sparingly. If you overplay pronouns, we lose the important words, right? So dial that back. And this is not just for Shakespeare. All actors need to avoid pronouns. Don't play the pronoun. Don't be afraid of the verse, right? As I said before, you need to know what iambic pentameter is because it's the default position in Shakespeare. But you need to embrace it, to feel that rhythm, that unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. Most of the time, the language is going to take care of that for you because English has a natural rhythmic stress pattern. Every word that has more than one syllable has a natural emphasis, right? Somewhere in the word. And most of the time, the Shakespeare will arrange them in such a way that you don't have to count syllables, you don't have to figure it out, but you need to be attuned to it. You need to hear it, you need to follow that rhythm, right? Because it's something that the whole production will get into. You need to use it to your advantage. And apart from anything else, it will help you choose the words that need the most stress within the sentence, right? Certainly within the line, right? It'll help you pick your operatives. While we're on the subject, rhythm is not pace. These are different things, right? You can feel the rhythm of the line without feeling like it all has to go at the same rate all the time. You can slow down, you can speed up, right? That's not dictated by the iambic. Likewise, intensity is not volume. I am sick of hearing actors shouting Shakespeare because they think that that's how to get it across. You wouldn't do that with other kinds of acting. Why do it with Shakespeare? And one of the problems that you see actors have is that they get to a point where they're shouting all the time, right? Where they get to, they're like, this is important, and then the next thing is even more important, and the next bit is even more important, and they've nowhere to go. So they get stuck in the same vocal register, and it's coming out at the same yelled volume all the time, and the audience feels like they're under attack. Find other ways to create intensity. Silence and pace is just as good a way, right? And that's just vocal. Think about what you can do with eye contact and with body language, other ways of adding intensity to what you're actually saying. Keep your operatives in check, right? You're used to the idea that in an iambic pentameter line, there are going to be in a regular iambic pentameter line, there are going to be 5 stresses within that 10 emphasis line, okay? That 10, within that 10 beat line. But if you emphasize every one of those 5 stresses, then the audience feels like they're being machine gunned. It's like having bricks thrown at you. It's a constant battle to separate what's important from what's not. So you choose your operatives carefully as you would in anything else, right? The iambic will help you find the words that are more important than the words which aren't, but you're not going to want to play more than 1 or 2 words per line or even per sentence, right? You have to help the audience to understand. So find where the meat of the sentence is. Which are the key words in the line, and play those. And don't overdo that. And limit it. Limit it so that it's only a couple of stress points per couple of lines, you know. When a line is irregular, ask yourself why. Often you'll be going along and it's in iambic pentameter, and then if you're doing it right, you'll feel the line kind of derail. There'll be a moment sometimes when the meter seems to break, when what was an iamb becomes a trochee or something else, where the stress pattern goes from unstressed, stressed, to suddenly it's stressed, unstressed, or something, right? Sometimes at the beginning of a line, or midway through, it'll derail. Always ask yourself, why is this happening? Assume that Shakespeare is competent and that little shift indicates something that's going on in the mind of the character or in the rhetorical strategy that he or she is taking in that particular moment. It always means something. Figure out what it means, make that choice. Similarly, when lines rhyme, ask yourself why, right? You'll often get a rhyming couplet at the end of a scene, which is a neat way of sort of tying it off and cueing the next moment. But when lines rhyme at other moments, what's going on there? Are we moving into some sort of different rhetorical register? Are we falling back on familiar wisdom? Are we trying to end the scene early? Any number of things might be in play. You should always ask yourself what's going on, because rhyming verse is not the default position of the Renaissance stage. Use shared lines. You'll notice, again, if you're using a decent edition, that sometimes you'll have regular iambic lines, full pentameter, full 10 stresses, and then you'll get one that's only 4 stresses. And the next person speaking, their line begins at the end of yours, and they've only got 6 stresses before they go into their next iambic line. The way that that's structured is to make those speeches roll over. The idea that you're beginning the iambic line and they're going to finish it, which means no pause in between, right? The rhythm suggests a kind of organic, fluid exchange of ideas that's happening in real time, right? So if your cue is a half line and then your first line is a half line, you need to come in right away on top of that half line to complete the previous speaker's meter, and you get a much better sense of fluidity. Use antithesis for balance and contrast. Antithesis is where a line will set something against something else. Sometimes it will happen within a single line, right? Black and white, hot and cold, right? Those will be in the same line. Sometimes it'll be in an entire speech where you'll have different things that are set against each other. And this is because Shakespeare comes from a particular rhetorical tradition where this is one of the ways you argue. You balance things against each other, right? When Cassius is talking about Caesar's frailties, and he's talking about how he had a fever and he was in the swimming contest and he started to drown and he had to be pulled out, and this man has now become a god. That's the closing of the antithesis. The first part sets up all these things, and then the next part says, here's the paradox, right? Exploit the paradox. Look for that sense of balance and see what the larger point is trying to say. Use those antitheses to your advantage. Look for beats in long speeches, particularly the way an argument is built in stages or from multiple reasons. Sometimes that beat might be a single sentence, maybe it'll be 2 or 3 sentences, but it will be building towards a larger point. Look where the speech begins, look where it ends, and look at how we get there. This is all part of that preparation work. You're not going to do it in real time in rehearsal. You're going to mark it. You're going to think it through. See, where does the thought finish? What's the new idea? How do these things relate to each other? How am I building a case or a statement of my emotional inner life? Whatever it is, use those movements within the speech to build the steps of an argument. In Shakespeare, you're always talking to an audience, even when you're on stage by yourself. It's not just thinking aloud. It's always trying to persuade somebody of something, right? Always an exercise in persuasion. Look for the way that that persuasion is being structured beat by beat. Think on the words, not between them. One of the things that we assume in modern drama is that the words tend to be the sort of tip of the iceberg, and often because of the way we communicate in the present, in realist terms, much of what we say is really unsaid. So we put a lot more emphasis on subtext. And there's a tendency then to take long pauses between lines or even between words within a line. Most of the time in Shakespeare, you do not need to do that. You don't want to do that. Assume that the character is thinking as they speak, that the thought is being formed through the utterance. You don't need to pause for a long time before saying something, right? Because the idea is that the thought is emerging through the words. So move away from that very post-Stanislavskian impulse to meditate, ruminate between utterance. That said, don't be afraid to pause, right? That said, don't be afraid to pause. You always need to let the words land. Make sure that the audience, make sure that the people who you're speaking to on stage hear what you're saying, right? And if that means that you need to slow it down, to let the moment hang for a second before you move on, then that's what you do. Don't race through it. Make sure that the words have the air to breathe. And a related point, remember that your audience is always modern. So sometimes things are going to need a little bit more of a modern sensibility. They're going to need a little bit more explication to make sure they understand. And let me say it again. Shakespeare is about communication. If you're not communicating with the people on stage, if you're not listening to them and responding clearly, and the audience isn't responding, if they're not hearing you and understanding, then I don't know what you're doing, right? But the whole point is to communicate. And sometimes that may mean making adjustments for a modern audience in terms of your delivery. It may mean taking a little bit more time over something. It may certainly mean, and it certainly means you can't justify an ancient idea or pronunciation or any of those kind of things if you think the audience is not going to understand it. They're there to be instructed and entertained, primarily entertained. You need to communicate with them. Related point, when you have done the work, let me emphasize that. When you have done the work, don't be afraid to suggest a cut or edit if you think a word or phrase is either unplayable, incomprehensible, or needlessly offensive. Shakespeare was a theatre writer, and as such, his text is a tool for actors, not a relic in a sanctuary. Sometimes it has to change, but the audience came to see Shakespeare. They're expecting to see Shakespeare. They don't want you to completely randomly rewrite it because you didn't really understand what you were dealing with. That's why I say, when you have done the work, if you run into a speech that you think is absolutely impossible to save, that's when you turn to the dramaturg or the director and say, what can we do about this? Can we modify it or cut it? And that's all. I hope you find some of this useful, helpful. Maybe I'll come back to some of it and spend a little more time on it another time. But again, let me emphasize, the important thing is that Shakespeare on stage is supposed to be communication. It's not supposed to be the sort of wheeling out of some high culture object from the past. If it's not working on stage as communication, then it's not working. All right, that's it. That's all I'm going to say. As ever, like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon page in the description. Check out my books. My newest book is Burning Shakespeare, a novel. And I will talk to you again soon.